There is something happening right now in the sports media world that the people in charge are absolutely desperate to keep buried. Not a rumor, not a fan theory, not some late-night Reddit conspiracy thread. What we are talking about today is a fully documented, multi-layered institutional crisis that has rattled the highest levels of sports broadcasting and exposed the ugly, rotting infrastructure underneath one of the most powerful media empires on the planet. And the wildest part? It all started because one woman was simply too good at basketball. We are not talking about a graphic error. We are not talking about a missed highlight or a biased pregame take from some overpaid studio analyst. What allegedly went down inside the operational tiers of the biggest sports network in the world is something that historians of this game are going to be studying and referencing for decades. Because when the system realized it could not contain Caitlin Clark, reports suggest it did not adapt. It did not celebrate her. Instead, it allegedly tried to erase her. And when that plan collapsed in real time on live national television, it was not an executive or a PR team that exposed it. It was her own teammate, Kelsey Mitchell, standing on the sideline with a microphone in her face, refusing to play along. This is the full story. Every layer, every angle, every word, and we are not skipping a single second of it. To understand why any of this matters, you have to go back to the moment Caitlin Clark entered the professional basketball landscape and immediately made every pre-existing media structure completely irrelevant. Before Clark arrived in the WNBA, the league operated on a very specific, very controlled media rhythm. The networks decided who the stars were. They built the graphics packages. They chose the highlight sequences. They dictated the narratives. It was an insulated, tightly managed ecosystem where the gatekeepers held all the power, and the athletes played by the rules the suits wrote for them. That was the deal. That was how it had always worked. And for a long time, it worked just fine for everyone sitting in those executive chairs. Then Caitlin Clark showed up and shattered every single one of those rules without even trying to. From her very first games in an Indiana Fever uniform, the numbers she was producing were not just impressive for a rookie. They were not just impressive for a first-year player adjusting to professional speed and competition. They were historically significant in ways that the league had genuinely never seen before. Viewership figures for Fever games began climbing at a pace that left analysts scrambling to find comparable data points. Casual sports fans who had never watched a single minute of WNBA basketball in their lives were suddenly tuning in specifically to watch her play. Arena attendance records that had stood for years began falling one after another like dominoes. The social media numbers were even more staggering. Clips of her handles, her long-range shooting, her vision as a playmaker were racking up views on every platform in volumes that would have been extraordinary for any athlete in any sport. She was not just drawing interest from basketball fans. She was pulling in people who had written off women's basketball entirely, people who had never given the league a real chance, and converting them into invested, passionate, vocal fans who were suddenly showing up to games, buying jerseys, and flooding comment sections with their opinions. The networks could not ignore it. They had no choice but to cover her. And that, right there, was the beginning of the problem. Because here's the thing about massive media institutions. They're built on control. They're built on the ability to manage the story, shape the narrative, and decide who gets the platform and on what terms. When an athlete comes along who generates that kind of organic, uncontrollable, self-sustaining wave of public interest, it does not fit neatly into the system. It cannot be packaged and managed the same way. And for executives who have spent their entire careers operating inside that system of total control, that kind of unpredictable, unmanageable influence is not exciting. It's terrifying.
Reports began circulating from insiders close to the network that the level of attention Caitlin Clark was receiving was creating genuine tension at the executive level. The concern, allegedly, was not that she was bad for the league. The concern was that she was impossible to control. Her fan base was massive, deeply loyal, and completely independent of whatever narrative the network was trying to push. They did not need the network to tell them to care about Caitlin Clark. They already did, and that made the traditional tools of media management completely useless. So the question became, what do you do with a superstar you cannot control? Apparently, the answer was deeply troubling. Here is where the story shifts from uncomfortable to genuinely alarming. Because what allegedly happened next was not simply a network choosing to undercover a certain player or give more airtime to a rival. What eagle-eyed fans and independent analysts began documenting was something far more deliberate, far more calculated, and far more damaging to the integrity of the sport's historical record. It started with the graphics. In any major sports broadcast, the on-screen statistical displays are supposed to be straightforward. You show the raw numbers, you show the historical comparisons, you show where a player ranks among the all-time greats in a given category, and you let the viewer draw their own conclusions. It is basic sports journalism. It is the foundation of how records and milestones get communicated to the public. But fans watching Caitlin Clark's games began noticing something deeply strange happening during those statistical segments. When the broadcast would put up graphics showing rookie records or all-time leaderboards, the numbers were not matching up with what independent databases and stat tracking sites were showing. The qualifiers being used to frame the statistics were oddly specific, suspiciously specific, in ways that seemed almost surgically designed to exclude Clark's contributions from the top of the list. Reports suggest the graphics department began applying filters and parameters that had no legitimate analytical basis. Qualifiers that narrowed the historical sample size in ways that conveniently pushed Clark's name down or off the screen entirely. Instead of showing clean, unfiltered historical comparisons, the displays were allegedly being manipulated to present a version of the record books that simply did not reflect reality. A version where Caitlin Clark's dominance was buried underneath a pile of arbitrary conditions that nobody had ever applied to any previous player's statistics before. Think about what that actually means for a second. If true, this is not a case of a network choosing which stories to tell. This is allegedly a case of a network actively altering the factual record of what a player has accomplished and presenting that altered record to millions of viewers as objective truth. That is not editorial bias. That is not a matter of perspective or framing. That is, if the reports are accurate, an intentional distortion of sports history designed specifically to diminish one player's legacy while it is still being written. The fans caught it quickly. Independent analysts began posting side-by-side comparisons showing the discrepancy between what the network was putting on screen and what the actual unfiltered statistical record showed. The gap was not subtle. It was not a rounding error or a minor definitional disagreement. The differences being documented were significant enough that they could not be explained away as accidents or oversights. The pattern was too consistent, too directional, always pointing the same way, always working against the same player, always serving the same narrative. Social media caught fire. The clips and comparisons spread across every platform within hours, and suddenly the network had a problem that was far bigger and far more public than whatever they had been trying to manage in the first place.
But rather than acknowledge the issue and correct the record, reports suggest the response from inside the network was to double down, to find another way to control the story, to find a way to make the problem go away without admitting that it ever existed. And that is when the strategy allegedly shifted from statistical manipulation to something even more cynical. Something that, if true, represents one of the most ruthless pieces of media manipulation in recent sports broadcasting history. They needed someone on the inside.
This is the part of the story that truly reveals how deep the alleged agenda ran. Because manipulating graphics and burying stats and qualifiers is one thing. It is cowardly and dishonest, but it operates at a distance. It is the kind of thing a network can always walk back by claiming an error or a miscommunication. But what allegedly came next was far more aggressive, far more personal, and it required recruiting someone who was supposed to be on Caitlin Clark's side. The target, allegedly, was Kelsey Mitchell. Now, if you know anything about Kelsey Mitchell's career and what she has meant to the Indiana Fever organization, you understand immediately why this was the move the network reportedly decided to make. Mitchell is not a fringe player. She is not a role piece or a depth option. She is a high-volume, elite-level scorer who carried this franchise through some of its darkest, most difficult years. She was there through the losing seasons, through the rebuilding phases, through the years when almost nobody outside of die-hard WNBA fans was paying attention to Indiana basketball. She bleeds Fever. She earned her place in that locker room through years of hard work when the cameras were not there and the national interest was nowhere to be found. Which is precisely why she was such an appealing target for what was allegedly being planned. The network's logic, apparently, was straightforward in the most cynical possible way. If they could get Kelsey Mitchell on camera saying anything that could be framed as frustration with Caitlin Clark's role on the team, with the media attention she was receiving, or with the dynamic inside the locker room, the entire anti-Clark narrative they had been trying to build would suddenly have credibility it had been completely lacking. Because it is one thing for a studio analyst or a rival fan base to claim that Clark is a divisive presence, it is something else entirely for a respected veteran teammate to say it on live television. So the plan, as reports describe it, was to corner Kelsey Mitchell on the sideline during a highly rated prime-time broadcast and ask her a series of loaded, carefully pre-constructed questions. Questions that were not really questions at all. They were traps, each one designed with a specific rhetorical architecture intended to funnel Mitchell toward expressing something negative about her teammate, something that could then be clipped, amplified, stripped of context, and used to validate the narrative the network had already decided it wanted to tell. The reporter assigned to this task reportedly believed the setup was airtight. The reasoning, presumably, was that Mitchell had every human reason to feel at least some ambivalence about the situation. She had paid dues in this league for years. She had built something real in Indiana without anywhere near the national recognition that Clark had received in her first season. If any current Fever player was going to have complicated feelings about the dynamic, Mitchell seemed like the most logical candidate. The reporter reportedly walked into that sideline interview, confident they were about to get exactly what the network needed.
They had completely, catastrophically misjudged the situation. What happened next has been described by people who witnessed it as one of the most remarkable moments in recent WNBA broadcasting history, and not because it was dramatic in the way the network had intended, but because it was the exact opposite of dramatic. It was calm, it was direct, and it was absolutely devastating. When the reporter came at Kelsey Mitchell with those loaded questions, framing Clark's high-usage play style as something potentially damaging to the veteran core of the team, Mitchell did not take the bait. She did not get flustered. She did not play into the emotional framing the reporter was pushing. She just looked straight at the situation, recognized it for exactly what it was, and shut it down with a precision that left the broadcast scrambling. She reportedly made it immediately clear that the only people trying to create drama around the Indiana Fever were the ones holding the microphones, not the players, not the coaching staff, not anyone inside that locker room. The narrative of internal conflict existed entirely in the heads of the people manufacturing it, and she had no interest in helping them build something that simply was not real.
She spoke about Caitlin Clark not as a complicated presence or disruptive force, but as exactly what she is, a generational playmaker whose impact on the game, on the league, and on the city of Indiana has been extraordinary and undeniable. She talked about their chemistry as a backcourt, about what it feels like to be part of something historic, and she made it abundantly clear that the bond inside that Fever locker room was not something a sideline interview or a loaded question was going to fracture. And then the broadcast cut away. Now, think carefully about that detail. A network does not cut away from a sideline interview because everything is going smoothly. A broadcast control room does not scramble to commercial break because the talent is delivering exactly what the network wants. They cut away because something happened they did not plan for, could not manage, and desperately needed to remove from the air as quickly as possible. The cut itself was an admission, an involuntary, unmistakable signal that the operation had failed, and failed badly. The clip spread across social media within minutes of the broadcast ending. Fans dissected every word Mitchell said, every moment of her composure, every signal of what she was actually communicating underneath the measured language. And the consensus across every corner of sports media was unanimous. Kelsey Mitchell had just walked into one of the most cynically constructed media traps in recent memory and dismantled it completely without raising her voice or losing her cool for a single second. The network had gambled that Kelsey Mitchell would be the weapon they needed to finally bring Caitlin Clark's momentum to heel. Instead, she became the person who exposed the entire operation in front of the world. But as significant as that moment was, it was not the only voice that needed to be heard. Here is something the network certainly did not anticipate when they launched this whole operation. Caitlin Clark does not need anyone to speak for her. In the period surrounding this entire controversy, Clark herself gave a rare, deeply personal, and remarkably honest account of what the media experience has actually been like for her. Not the polished press conference version, not the careful PR-approved talking points, the real version, the one where you can hear the weight of it in every sentence.
She talked about what it feels like to walk out of the locker room after a game and immediately feel your shoulders tighten because you know the conversation is not going to be about basketball. It is not going to be about what happened on the court, about the plays that worked, about the adjustments the team needs to make. It is going to be about whatever narrative has been manufactured around her for that particular news cycle. Whatever angle someone has decided is the most clickable, the most controversial, the most likely to generate the kind of engagement that keeps the content machine running. She described it as emotionally exhausting, not in a self-pitying way, not as a complaint or a plea for sympathy, just as a fact, a reality of her professional life that she has had to learn to carry alongside everything else she is managing as a young player trying to establish herself in one of the most scrutinized first seasons in league history. What hit hardest was what she said about her character, because beyond the statistical manipulation and the loaded sideline interviews, the dimension of this media situation that Clark found most difficult to navigate was people making definitive public statements about who she is as a person, without ever having had a single real conversation with her. Writers, analysts, commentators publishing takes about her motivations, her attitudes, her impact on teammates, and on the broader culture of the league. All of it built entirely on projection and assumption, rather than any actual knowledge of who Caitlin Clark is. She was direct about it in a way that felt genuinely earned. She acknowledged that media coverage is a profession and that people have jobs to do and opinions to express. She was not asking for special treatment or blanket protection from criticism. But there is a clear and meaningful line between analyzing someone's play and making accusations about their character and their identity as a person. And that line, she said plainly, had been crossed, repeatedly, by people who had never sat across from her, never had a real conversation with her, never made any genuine effort to understand her beyond the narrative they had already decided to tell.
And then she said something that landed with a kind of quiet, unshakable power. She said that through all of it, through every hit piece and every manufactured controversy and every moment of off-court noise that threatened to pull her away from why she plays this game in the first place, she comes back to one thing: the love and the joy she feels when she steps between those lines. The dream she has been chasing since she was a kid, the one that belongs to her. And she said with complete and total certainty that nobody has taken that from her, and nobody will. That is not the statement of someone who is crumbling under the pressure. That is the statement of someone who understands exactly who she is, exactly where she is going, and exactly how little the noise around her actually matters in the long run. After Clark's comments circulated, and after Mitchell's sideline moment became the story of the week, the network's studio shows had to respond, and the way they chose to respond revealed perhaps more clearly than anything else in this entire saga just how deep the institutional resistance to Caitlin Clark's success actually runs. The most striking example came from a prominent studio analyst whose commentary in the days following the controversy became a flashpoint of its own. Instead of engaging honestly with what Clark had said and what Mitchell had done, the response was to pivot immediately to accountability, to suggest that Clark, as a young player still finding her footing in the league, needed to develop a greater sense of responsibility for her role in what was being called the larger sisterhood of the WNBA. Let that framing sink in for a moment, because it is worth examining very carefully. A player describes being emotionally drained by a media environment that refuses to cover her as a basketball player and instead manufactures controversy around her character and her relationships. She speaks honestly and with evident pain about having her identity publicly misrepresented by people who have never taken the time to know her, and the institutional response from a prominent voice within that same media ecosystem is to suggest that she is the one who needs to develop more accountability.
Not the writers who published opinion pieces making sweeping claims about her character. Not the analysts who spent months stoking controversy around her fan base and her relationships with teammates. Not the broadcast that allegedly ran manipulated statistics to push her name off the leaderboards. Her, the one who said plainly and honestly that she just wants to play basketball. The deflection was so transparent that even the other voices in the studio conversation seemed visibly uncomfortable with it. There were moments in that broadcast where you could almost see the effort required to keep the conversation on the rails the network had laid out for it. Other analysts tried to steer things back toward the basketball, back toward the actual substance of what was being discussed, but the damage had already been done. Because here is what that response actually communicated, whether it intended to or not. When a media institution responds to a legitimate, well-documented criticism of its coverage practices, not by examining those practices, but by immediately redirecting the focus onto the subject of the criticism, it is not engaging with the issue, it is confirming it. Every pivot, every accountability redirect, every subtle implication that Clark bears some responsibility for the media climate around her is its own form of evidence that the people making those arguments are far more interested in protecting the narrative than in honest sports journalism. The audience noticed. Social media made sure of that. Strip away the drama for a moment. Set aside the specific sideline interview, the statistical graphics controversy, the studio responses, and the social media wars. Step back from all of it and look at what this situation is actually revealing about the state of sports media in 2024 and beyond. What the Caitlin Clark situation has exposed more clearly and more publicly than perhaps any story in recent sports broadcasting history is the fundamental tension that exists when a genuinely transformative athlete arrives in a league that the traditional media establishment has spent years dramatically undercovering. The WNBA has produced remarkable players, remarkable stories, and remarkable basketball for decades. Most of it was covered with a fraction of the resources, a fraction of the airtime, and a fraction of the institutional investment that comparable achievements in men's sports would have automatically received. That disparity created a specific kind of media culture around the league, one that was deeply protective of the narrative it had built, one that was slow to invite outside attention and somewhat suspicious of the terms on which new audiences were arriving. When those new audiences arrived specifically because of Caitlin Clark, because of a player who had not been developed and packaged by the traditional WNBA media establishment, but had built her own massive following entirely outside of it, the cultural friction was inevitable. But what makes the situation genuinely alarming, rather than simply complicated, is the degree to which that friction appears to have influenced actual editorial decisions. Reports of statistical manipulation, patterns of coverage that eagle-eyed fans documented over weeks and months, studio conversations that consistently steered toward controversy rather than basketball, sideline interviews that were clearly designed to manufacture conflict rather than illuminate the game. These are not the symptoms of cultural friction. These are the symptoms of an institution making active, deliberate choices about how to manage a story it cannot control. And the people paying the price for those choices are not the executives in the glass towers. They are the players on the floor. They are the Kelsey Mitchells who have to fight through loaded interview questions on national television when they should just be talking about the game they spent years perfecting. They are the Caitlin Clarks who walk out of locker rooms with tight shoulders because they know the conversation is not about basketball. They are the fans of the sport who deserve honest, straightforward coverage of the extraordinary things happening on the court, and instead get handed a manufactured drama designed to serve someone else's institutional agenda. The system, as currently constructed, is failing the sport. And the fact that it took a rookie point guard from Iowa to expose that failure on the kind of scale that forced the entire country to pay attention is simultaneously the most inspiring and the most damning about this entire situation.
Something has to change. And based on what we have seen from the players themselves, from Mitchell's sideline clarity to Clark's honest reckoning with what the media experience actually costs her, the people most committed to forcing that change are not going to be the executives. They are going to be the athletes who simply refuse to play the game the network has written for them. So where does all of this go from here? What actually happens after a week like this one? After a sideline moment goes viral? After a player's honest words about media exhaustion dominate sports discourse for days? After the seams of the institutional machinery are this visible to this many people at once? If history is any guide, the immediate impulse within the network will be to recalibrate quietly, to pull back on the most obvious expressions of the agenda, to be slightly more careful about the graphics and the qualifiers, to instruct the sideline reporters to approach fever players with a bit more caution for a while. The expectation will be that the news cycle moves on, that the audience's attention shifts to the next story, and that the structural incentives that produced this situation in the first place can be gradually reinstated once the spotlight dims. But this time, there is a significant reason to believe that playbook will not work the way it always has before. The audience watching Caitlin Clark is not a casual viewership that will quietly drift away between news cycles. It is one of the most engaged, most attentive, most digitally active fan communities in modern sports. These are people who have been tracking the statistical discrepancies, archiving the coverage patterns, documenting the inconsistencies, and sharing all of it across every platform with a level of organizational energy that traditional media institutions are genuinely not equipped to counter. Every time the graphics get quietly adjusted to push Clark's numbers down, someone is going to notice. Every time a studio segment frames her in a way that does not match what the actual data shows, someone is going to clip it and put it next to the truth. The accountability infrastructure that exists around Caitlin Clark's career is unlike anything that has existed around a women's basketball player before. And that means the traditional strategy of waiting out the controversy and quietly returning to business as usual carries a level of risk that it never carried before. The Indiana Fever as a team also matter in this equation, because what the Kelsey Mitchell moment demonstrated is that the locker room is not going to fracture the way the network reportedly needed it to. The chemistry between Clark and her teammates is real, documented, and has now been publicly affirmed in a moment that the entire sports world saw and remembered. Any future attempt to manufacture internal drama is going to land against the backdrop of that moment. Any loaded question on any future sideline is going to be heard with the memory of Mitchell shutting the last one down still fresh in everyone's mind. The most important voice in all of this remains Clark's own, because what she said about the love and the joy she feels for the game and the fact that nobody has taken that from her is not just an inspiring personal statement, it is a strategic one. It is a declaration that the noise around her does not have the power to determine who she is or what she does on the court. And as long as she keeps producing at the level she has been producing, as long as the Fever keep building towards something real, the story that ultimately gets told about this chapter of WNBA history is going to be the one the basketball writes, not the one the network tried to manufacture. That is not something any graphic filter or loaded sideline question can change. Here's what we know when all the noise settles and all the manufactured drama gets stripped away.
Caitlin Clark came into the WNBA and did something that the sport had never seen before. Not just in terms of what she did on the court, though what she did on the court was genuinely historic, but in terms of what she did for the visibility, the cultural relevance, and the mainstream conversation around women's basketball. She brought millions of people to a league that deserved their attention long before she arrived. She made the WNBA impossible to ignore at a scale that no individual player had ever managed before her. And the response from some corners of the institutional media establishment, if the reports and documentation are accurate, was not to celebrate that. It was to manage it, to filter it, to try to contain and diminish and redirect the narrative in ways that served the network's existing power structure rather than the sport's long-term health. They allegedly tried to bury her in the record books with arbitrary qualifiers. They reportedly tried to turn her own teammates against her on national television. They responded to her honest, human account of media exhaustion by suggesting she needed more accountability. And through all of it, the players on the floor, Clark and Mitchell and every woman in that Fever locker room, just kept doing what they came here to do: play championship-level basketball. Build something real. Refuse to let anyone else write the story of what they are building together. Kelsey Mitchell standing on that sideline and refusing to betray her teammate is not just a moment in a WNBA season. It is a statement about what integrity looks like when the pressure is highest and the cameras are rolling and someone with a microphone is betting that you will take the easy path. She did not take it, and the entire sports world saw exactly who she is because of it. Caitlin Clark talking about the joy that nobody has taken from her and nobody will is not just a reassuring quote. It is a blueprint for how a genuinely elite competitor processes the kind of institutional resistance that would have broken a lesser player. She has not let it make her smaller. If anything, it appears to have made her more certain of exactly who she is and exactly what she is capable of. The record books are going to remember what happened on the court, the real record books, the unfiltered ones that no graphics department can quietly manipulate. And what they are going to show is a player who was too big for the system trying to contain her, supported by teammates who were too loyal to be weaponized against her, watched by an audience too attentive to be fooled by the filters. The network tried to write this story. The basketball wrote it instead. And that story is just getting started.